Alright, welcome to another episode of Performance That Matters. Today we are answering the question, how many calories should I eat for my sport? This may seem like a really straightforward question to answer, but the reality is that it is a bit more complicated. Rather than me just give you some simple equations, I'm going to break down what exactly a calorie is, answer are all calories created the same, talk about how our body extracts calories from food, what the energy currency of our body is, and how we take all that information to get a number that works for you. Whether you are trying to eat to perform your best in your sport, lose weight, or something in between, this information is really important. Let's get to it. Before we dive into it, I want to give you some real life examples of just how different individual calorie requirements can be depending on the individual. What I'm about to read you are the daily calorie needs of a UFC champ during fight camp while they're cutting weight, an ultra-endurance athlete getting ready for a 100-mile race while they're carb loading, and a 45-year-old businessman who is losing weight to improve their body composition. Now, the UFC fighter consumes 3,200 calories, which consists of 470 grams of carbs, 150 grams of protein, and 80 grams of fat. The ultra-endurance runner's daily intake is 5,375 calories, which comprises of 900 grams of carbs, 185 grams of protein, and 115 grams of fat. The businessman, his intake is 2,400 calories, comprising of 225 grams of carbs, 150 grams of protein, and 100 grams of fat. Now, by the end of this episode, you're going to have a better appreciation as to why each of these people have such different calorie intakes and understand the reasoning why those differences occur. The first thing we need to cover is that a calorie is not a physical thing in the sense that you could pick it up and throw it across the room. A calorie is a unit of energy, and the way we describe the amount of energy that a calorie gives off is a bit strange. We say that it is the amount of heat needed to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Weird, huh? Don't worry, that doesn't have a lot of practical value unless you're a physicist, but by definition, that is what a calorie is. But it gets even more confusing when we talk about food. When we talk about a calorie in reference to food, we are really talking about a large calorie. What do I mean by large? Well, we have small and large calories. A small calorie is just 1 calorie and is the measurement I mentioned just a moment ago. A large calorie is 1,000 calories and is the amount of heat needed to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. A large calorie is referred to as a kilocalorie. In food and nutrition, we actually work in kilocalories, but we use the term calories as if we were referencing a small calorie. So when we say that a food has 250 calories, the more correct way to say it would be that food has 250 kilocalories or 250,000 calories. Confusing, hey? What seems to be a pretty straightforward thing is already a bit mind-bending, and we haven't got very far yet. Now, the measurement of a calorie started sometime in the early 1800s, and it was used mostly by French engineers and physicists to talk about heat and steam engines. And it wasn't until later in the 1800s when European scientists started discussing the concept of a calorie in relation to food, energy, and metabolism that it became more adopted. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1800s when American chemist W.O. Atwater came across the concept while studying abroad in Germany that it was brought back to the US. Atwater, alongside other physicists, conducted experiments to determine the energy output of the human body and, as such, determine the energy quantity of foods. His experiments would give us the basis as to why we know that carbs and protein provide 4 calories per gram and fat provides 9. It wasn't until 1887 when Atwater published this work that it took root in American nutrition and eventually food policy and labeling. Further work that improved these original experiments would show that measuring calories in food wasn't so straightforward. Although the numbers we have for food nowadays are pretty good, it has been shown that qualities such as fiber content, cooking, processing, and even the food matrix can all affect how that food is digested in the body and how many calories are produced. That is why non-digestible fibers, which are carbohydrates, are assigned a calorie value of 2 calories per gram as they are only partially fermented in the large intestine. This is also why cooking, which denatures protein and gelatinizes starches, can increase the energy that can be metabolized. And the last thing we need to discuss before we move on is the fact that the term calorie is not exactly the best way to describe food energy either. The more correct term to describe energy is a joule, which is what is used in pretty much all other areas of science when we're talking about energy. The joule is also the standard measure in the International System of Units, or SI units. This is why countries like Australia, the UK, and Europe use kilojoules on food labels as opposed to kilocalories like the US and Canada. We don't have time to discuss why some countries use this measure and others don't. All you need to know is that both are correct, and you can easily convert between the two by knowing that 1 kilocalorie is equal to 4.184 kilojoules. So if a food has 200 kilocalories, it has 836 kilojoules. Got all that? All right, let's move on. In order for our body to get energy from food, it has to be extracted. And the way our body does that is through digestion and absorption. Different foods contain different combinations of fat, protein, and carbs, and thus provide different calories. For example, a banana contains 27 grams of carbs, 1.3 grams of protein, and 1 gram of fat for a total of 105 calories, while a large egg has 6.3 grams of protein, 4.8 grams of fat, and 0.4 grams of carbs for a total of just 72 calories. When we eat food, it is passed down our esophagus and then into our stomach. It then passes through our small intestine, then our large intestine, and eventually out the other end to the toilet. But all you need to know right now is that different foods are digested at different parts of the digestive tract based on their macronutrient composition. For example, fiber is mostly fermented in the large intestine, where simple sugars are digested in the mouth, stomach, and the start of the small intestine. What's important to know is that the macronutrients, i.e. the carbs, protein, and fats, are broken down to their building blocks, which are glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids. Now, these molecules are all held together by chemical bonds, and it is within these bonds where the energy is contained. The more bonds, the more energy. To get the energy from these bonds, our body has to make a molecule that is called ATP. This is the energy currency of our body. All of the food we eat goes through different processes to make different amounts of ATP. We don't need to cover the physiology of this in too much detail right now, but all you need to know is that we eat food, we break it down to its building blocks, those building blocks go to different cells in the body, and a specific part of those cells extract the energy from the building blocks to create ATP, which all of the cells in our body can then use to fuel daily life, training, and everything in between, which leads us to our next section. If we can appreciate that our body has a complex system to extract energy from food so that we can fuel our life, we next need to understand how our body uses those calories every day to keep us alive and functioning. This number is called the total daily energy expenditure, and it comprises of 4 parts: basal metabolic rate, thermic effect of food, NEAT, and physical activity. Our basal metabolic rate can be thought of as the energy to keep everything in our body working at rest. In other words, this is the amount of calories you need for your body to function if you were to just lay in bed all day. Our metabolic rate consumes the highest amount of calories, being anywhere from 60 to 75% of our daily total. This can change based on a few factors such as body composition, overall body size, hormonal status, especially the sex hormones in our thyroid, and even illness. The next is the thermic effect of food, which is a fancy way of saying to digest our food and turn it into poop. This typically takes up about 10% of your total daily energy expenditure, but it can vary pretty dramatically based on how much you actually eat. The more you eat, the more energy you need to digest that food. What is also interesting is that our body uses different amounts of energy to digest the different macronutrients. Protein requires the most energy to digest, followed by alcohol, carbohydrates, and then fat. And this is part of the reason why high protein diets are promoted so heavily in weight loss phases. The energy our body uses to digest our food is mostly influenced by the composition of the food we are eating. For example, eating a meal of just jelly beans requires less energy to digest than eating a meal of sweet potato, vegetables, and some chicken. The fiber content of your food also increases the energy required because it passes further through the digestive tract. All in all, the more whole foods and fiber in your meal, the more energy your body will need to use in order to break it down. Now, one of the most talked about ways we burn energy is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT for short. If you've ever tried to lose weight or you're an avid listener of most health and fitness podcasts, you would have no doubt heard about this. This describes all of the movement that you do that isn't planned physical activity. Think boiling the kettle, typing on your keyboard, doing chores, you get the idea. This is an interesting one because it can vary massively between individuals based on their lifestyle. For example, office workers generally have a very low NEAT, whereas tradesmen and labourers have much higher due to the physical demands of their job. NEAT is interesting because it is one of the most reactive to the body's energy status. Take someone who is usually a ball of energy and put them on a really calorie restricted diet, one of the first things that reduce is their NEAT. And you'll see them sit down much more, they won't fidget as much, and they're just generally much quieter. Conversely, we can see the opposite when excess energy is consumed. Think of a kid who just ripped into a whole pack of candy. NEAT can contribute anywhere from 15 all the way up to 50% of our energy consumption. As I said, it is a very interesting one and very dependent on our lifestyle and diet. Finally, planned physical activity is the final way our body burns energy. This includes all exercise. Funnily enough, this is the most overestimated component of our total daily energy expenditure. That is because many incorrectly associate fatigue with calories burnt. And although that is true to an extent, what largely determines how many calories you burn in exercise is the volume that you're doing. For example, someone who does a hard HIIT class for 50 minutes may burn 400 to 500 calories. However, someone who runs conservatively for 4 hours can burn up to 2,000 calories. That's not because running is necessarily harder, there's just more volume and time spent exercising. And as we become more efficient at exercise, we also tend to burn less calories for the same effort, despite feeling fatigued. This is something we see a lot with highly trained athletes. The contribution to the daily energy expenditure will vary immensely, but is typically only 10 to 20%, and it is affected by training intensity, volume, frequency, and training status. So if we put all of this together, then we get the following output. Our total daily energy expenditure is 60% our metabolism, 30% NEAT, 10% digestion, and 10% physical activity. Again, this will vary based on your own lifestyle and training status. Now that you know the components of your daily energy expenditure, how do you figure out what your specific number is? Well, there are 3 ways to approach this: highly technical lab-based measurements, predictive equations, and outcome-based measures. And in my opinion, just 2 of these are needed to get a really accurate number. Firstly, when energy expenditure is studied in labs, scientists use 2 different methods. One called direct calorimetry, and the second called indirect calorimetry. Direct calorimetry is quite a crazy concept. A participant will stand in a chamber that has been purpose-built to analyze all of the gases that are produced in the room from the participant. Scientists can then analyze these gases and get a very accurate measure of how much energy your body has produced in that given time frame. They can do that because the gases we breathe out are byproducts of our metabolism. Cool, huh? But these chambers are difficult to find, so instead, you'll have a better chance of getting access to indirect calorimetry, which is also called a metabolic cart. These are portable carts that you can breathe into for a set amount of time, usually 20 minutes or so, and the cart will analyze the gases that you breathe out. Metabolic carts are great because they are portable, but can be less accurate than a tightly controlled chamber purely due to human and machine error. The final way you can measure your energy very accurately is through a process called doubly labeled water. This is generally what we see in real-world experiments, like seeing how many calories ultra-endurance runners burn during a race. This involves participants drinking water that has 2 stable isotopes, basically tags that scientists can track every time the participants go to the bathroom or give a blood sample. Again, based on how much is present in the sample, the scientists can pretty accurately work out the energy expenditure for that particular time period. Those 3 measurements are great if you have access to them, which 99% of people do not. So instead, these are going to be your next best bet, and they are the predictive equations. In my opinion, combining these with outcome-based measures is the best way to calculate your daily calories. In fact, it is not just my opinion. The very best sports scientists in the world all agree this is the best method. Firstly, the predictive equations have all been derived in relatively the same way. The scientists by whom they are named after looked at energy expenditure data on different populations and extrapolated equations based on data points such as height, weight, age, and sex. Over the years, this has produced a number of equations such as the Harris-Benedict, the Schofield, the Mifflin-St. Jeor, and the Cunningham, just to name a few. Many equations are updates of the original Harris-Benedict that was proposed around 1918, and each offers something unique. For example, the Mifflin St. John is considered best for outpatient US adults and is used by many US-based health workers, whereas the Cunningham equation is often said to be the best for athletes as it incorporates fat-free mass obtained from body composition scans. So which one is best? Well, in my honest opinion, they all can work, but it isn't so much about getting the equation right. That's just a starting point. It's about everything that comes afterwards. It's about setting a goal, setting subjective and objective measures to track, using an equation, being consistent, and adjusting from there. In all honesty, that is my job in a nutshell. Sure, some of my athletes have the luxury of going and getting those fancy tests done to make that process easier, but all the results come from the monitoring and the adjustment. In order to do that properly, you need to understand the warning signs that you are getting it wrong. That is why we need to discuss the concept of energy availability and what happens to your body when you're in a state of low energy availability. But first, let's talk about exercise. When it comes to calculating exercise energy expenditure, it is no easy task. Similar to resting energy expenditure, there exist a number of methods, some of which we consider gold standard and others not so much. As is the case with estimating BMR, it is a case of trade-off between accuracy and accessibility. Again, direct calorimetry is the gold standard, but is confined to a lab and inaccessible to 99.9% of people. However, indirect calorimetry is far more common and accessible to athletes. Many sports institutes, facilities, clubs, and gyms will have a metabolic cart with a trained practitioner. It is common to complete a VO2 max test where data can be collected to help extrapolate calorie expenditure at particular stages of exercise. Like all tests though, the interpretation is important, as is the protocol that is used, so if you are going to do this, make sure you do it with a trained practitioner who understands the sport you are competing in. Funnily enough, if you're a cyclist and you have access to a power meter, then you're going to get one of the better estimates of your exercise energy expenditure. That is because the external work that you are doing is known, and you can apply what is called an efficiency factor to convert your effort to calories. This is surprisingly accurate, given you get the efficiency factor correct. But the most accessible piece of equipment athletes have access to are wearables. These are things like your Whoops, Garmin's, Fitbits, Apple Watches, etc., etc. Now, the way these work is by taking your personal data, such as heart rate, height, weight, gender, and plugging that information into predictive equations to give you an estimate of your energy burnt during exercise. Now, each device has their own equations that they will use in order to do this. But depending what data you read, wearables have been reported to be between 28 and 93% inaccurate when it comes to estimating calorie output. To add to this, when you look outside of the scientific literature, there are a number of individuals who test these out against more rigorous lab data. For example, they go to a sports lab and get measured while using their device to see the difference between the two numbers. And spoiler, there is almost always a substantial difference. Now, that is not great science, but to be honest, it's probably giving you a real life scenario that you could absolutely do if you're a serious athlete. If you have access to a sports lab, go get a VO2 max test done and wear your device and see the difference. At least you can become more informed about how it represents your output. This is not to say wearables are useless, but use them with caution and as a guide only. The next way you can estimate your calorie expenditure is by using what we call metabolic equivalents. A MET, as we call them, is a way to express caloric output of different activities relative to a pre-established resting metabolic rate. Different activities have been assigned MET values based on studies where participants undertook indirect calorimetry while doing the activity. There are MET values for so many different types of activities, and if you want to use this system, you just use the one that is most relevant for you, such as walking at 4 miles per hour, which has a MET of 5.0, and you plug it into the equation, which is METs times 3.5 times your body weight in kilograms divided by 200, which gives you the kilocalories burnt per minute, and you get a good estimation of your caloric output. Again, take METs for what they are. They are an easily accessible option to give you some type of bearing of what you could be burning during your activity. I think for non-athletic populations, these are quite good. As a guide, they're not too bad. The last one I feel worth noting are what we call activity multipliers. And in my personal opinion, they're probably the easiest and most effective measurement to use. This is a group of bands that range from sedentary all the way to extremely active with some guiding definitions, such as sedentary being defined as working all day from a desk, less than 5 to 6,000 steps a day, and no formal training, and extremely active as heavy manual labor or 2 training sessions a day. The multipliers assign a number to increase your metabolic rate by to compensate for your daily activity levels. Again, the flaws in this are quite obvious. They are quite broad statements. The definitions are really ambiguous, i.e., my definition of moderate exercise may be 12 hours of training a week, while yours might be just 4. And they don't necessarily specify what is good for athletes in different sports. But in saying all of that, this is actually the concept I prefer, and we as a team have built out our own activity multipliers based on our athletes' lab data, and we have found this to be a very easy way to help us predict their exercise output once we have established their resting metabolic rate. Alright, let's get to the good stuff. We're going to talk about how to track whether you've got your intake right or wrong, and to do that, you need to understand what to look out for when you get it very wrong. I'm sure you have heard of the concept of energy balance. This is where the phrase calories in versus calories out comes from, and this forms the basis of weight loss, weight maintenance, and weight gain. Put simply, if you eat more calories than you burn, you gain weight. If you eat less, you lose weight, and if you eat what your body needs, you remain weight stable. This framework holds true, but it simplifies the process and does not give the body enough credit for just how complex those processes are. For an example, when we increase our exercise, our body will tend to decrease NEAT in an attempt to maintain this energy balance. Another example is the increase in hunger signals that come when our body fat stores reduce. This is another attempt to maintain this energy balance. These don't necessarily violate the calories in, calories out rule, but it makes the process much more complex than it seems at face value. The best way we can explain these adaptations that come when we change our energy intake is through the concept of energy availability. Now, I will be the first to say that the energy availability model is far from a perfect system, and we still have a lot of work to do with it. But it is a great concept, and the concept holds true in practice. Now, energy availability, by definition, is the energy intake from food minus energy from exercise expenditure divided by fat-free mass. Now, there's an obvious flaw straight away which you will already appreciate, and that's that our body burns energy in more ways than just exercise. And this has been widely criticized. However, the equation is attempting to give a system to decide whether you are eating enough based on the exercise you are doing, hence why it's set up like this. Essentially, the goal is to define a quantitative point that says yes, this range is enough calories for your body to function properly, and anything above this will tip the energy balance equation towards weight gain, and anything below will tip it towards weight loss. It also gives us a system where it recognizes that people with higher muscle mass require more calories in order to function properly. And you can demonstrate that with an example of two 80-kilogram people who both eat 2,500 calories a day and burn 500 calories in exercise, but one has a body fat percentage of 10% and the other 20%. When you plug those numbers into the equation, the leaner person has an energy availability of 27.7 kilocalories per kilogram, and the higher body fat person has an energy availability of 31.25 kilocalories per kilogram. Now, we won't get into it this time, but 30 kilocalories per kilogram has been designated as the threshold for adequate intake. So you could say in this example, person A needs to eat more to fulfill their adequate intake, while person B is eating enough. Again, there are many criticisms of the actual science underpinning this equation, but the concepts do hold true. There is a point at which your body says this is not enough fuel, a point at which it is adequate, and a point where there is too much. An important discussion that comes out of this is the concept of low energy availability, which is exactly what it sounds like. You are eating below what your body needs to function. In the short term, your body can make adjustments in order to balance out this low energy availability. Like we spoke about above, if you increase your calories by exercising, then your body will likely decrease NEAT in order to maintain energy balance and keep you in adequate energy availability. Is when you do this in the long term, or what we call chronically, where it can get problematic. Sure, you will lose weight, but if you don't give your body enough energy over a long period of time, it has to ration out the calories. The best way to think about this is an iPhone going into battery saver mode where it shuts off all non-essential apps. Your body does the same thing, and for athletes, it can wreak havoc on your performance and your health. This state is what we call REDS, which stands for Relative Energy Deficiency. And this has been one of the biggest talking points in sports nutrition for the past decade. Academics, researchers, practitioners, athletes, coaches, and everyone else in sport argue about REDS all the time. At what point does it occur? What's the best way to diagnose it? Is it more prevalent in females than it is males? The list of questions goes on and on. But the one thing we do all agree on is that it does occur. Whether we completely understand it or not, it does occur, and we know that because of the symptoms we see in athletes who chronically underfuel. The symptoms we see are fatigue, weakness, increased injuries and/or stress fractures, frequent illness, loss of libido, loss of menstrual function, hormonal decreases such as testosterone and thyroid, hair loss, dry skin, rashes, irritability, mood swings, anxiety, depression, and indigestion. Yes, I know, that's a lot. But not everyone responds to REDS the same way, and even though that equation isn't perfect, it does seem that everyone has a particular number that will bring on these symptoms for them. The reason this is important to understand is when it comes to determining what is right for you, it isn't as simple as Googling a calorie calculator and just eating whatever it tells you. To fuel yourself properly, you have to have a system where you can assess both objectively and subjectively how your body is responding to the intake and adjust accordingly. I work with a lot of clients who are not elite athletes, but are high-performing individuals, say businessmen or women, professionals, highly active parents, etc. This is one of the exercises I take them through so they can understand this concept better. I obtain a DEXA scan from them, and I use our system to calculate what I believe to be their adequate calorie intake. What we then do is rigorously track their intake every day for 3 weeks, hitting what I deem as their optimal intake to put them in adequate energy availability. Once they have a good grip on this, we go on an aggressive short-term deficit. Now, this is not necessarily healthy, but it gives them a really important lesson on recognizing what happens to your body when you drop into this state of low energy availability. This is where they'll report hunger, mood swings, difficulty focusing at work, being really irritable with their partner, and they will usually see a decrease in their performance in the gym or at training. These are all things we don't want, and then we see these rectify once we increase our calorie intake back up to adequate energy availability. Now, a big reason I do this is because a lot of people have what I say are pretty unrealistic body composition goals. And this is part of a process where I can help them make a more informed decision about whether or not they want to go through what it takes to achieve those goals. After we do this, every single one of them comes back and says, you know what, I feel so much better on these higher calories, and we work on optimizing every other part of their diet and lifestyle and usually ditch the unrealistic, outdated body image goals. Now, this should give you a pretty good understanding of the theory behind getting your calories right. You've got an equation to work it out, you understand what to look for if you get it wrong. Now we need to set some boundaries and put all of this together so you can start putting it to practice. First and foremost, you need to be very clear on what your goal is. And if you're an athlete, this is likely going to change based on the phase of training you're in. You may be out of season and focusing on putting on muscle, or you may be trying to lose body fat, or you could be in season and the focus is optimal fueling day in and day out to support performance and recovery. This will change for every athlete and change throughout the year, but it has to be very crystal clear from the get-go. Once you have set your goal, you need to determine your caloric intake. I would recommend using the Mifflin-St. Jeor or the Cunningham equation if you have access to a body composition scan. The next thing you have to do is set your exercise energy calories. I would recommend doing this in 2 ways. First, using a wearable, but knowing that it will likely overshoot the calories burnt prediction, which is perfectly fine. Or you use an activity multiplier and go for a band that suits your training status. To do this, you obviously have to collect some data from your wearable, and for your multiplier, if you're on the fence which band to go into, go the higher one. And the reason I suggest this is because you will likely overshoot your calories, and in my mind, it is always better to overshoot than to undershoot. The reason being, it is much easier and risk averse to wind calories back than to have to build them back up. Now, the last thing we need to discuss is your fundamental ethos behind your nutritional approach. And what I'm talking about is whether you want to strictly track all of your intake using tracking apps such as Chronometer or MyFitnessPal, or if you prefer using an outcome-based approach such as monitoring your body weight, performance outcomes, red symptoms, or other objective and subjective measures. The reason this is so important is because the reality of sports and nutrition is that it can play havoc on your mental health. And there are so many athletes that fall victim to disordered eating, eating disorders, body image issues, and bad relationships with food due to an obsession with having to track every single gram of food that they eat. Although I do appreciate this, I do believe there is merit in tracking, given you have 1, the right guidance from a professional, and 2, you have the right knowledge of why you are doing it. I also believe that using a blended approach, where you track your intake long enough to understand what is in the foods that you commonly eat, but also learn how to monitor your performance, health, and relationship with food, leads to you becoming more intuitive with your eating over the long run. To finish this off, let's go through an example, and I will use a real life client. I'll show you how I walked him through this process of figuring out how much he needs to eat. He is a fit 35-year-old business professional who also plays high-level competitive sport. He trains anywhere between 3 and 5 days a week while running his own business, and he has a young family. He had 2 initial goals. He wanted to be able to fuel not only his training but his busy lifestyle and be able to show up for his family every day, but he also wanted to shed a couple pounds as he thought he was carrying a little extra on his frame. First of all, we got a DEXA scan, and I got him to get some routine blood work to make sure there wasn't anything out of the ordinary that we needed to address. From the DEXA, we saw that his fat mass was 19.7 kilograms and his lean mass was 76.8 kilograms. I then plugged his fat-free mass into the Cunningham equation, which is 22 times 80.8 kilograms, his fat-free mass, plus 500, which equaled 2,277 calories as his resting metabolic rate. From here, I can make a few decisions to calculate his calories to include his activities. From here, I can make a few decisions to calculate his overall calorie intake based on his activity levels. As I said earlier, I like using a multiplier, and even if we use the stock standard definitions, we can say that because he does moderate exercise 3 to 5 days per week, we can multiply his resting calories by 1.5. When we do this, we are left with his total daily energy expenditure being 3,415 calories. And for a 100 kilogram man who trains most days, this seems about right. When we did a dietary recall with him, he was actually eating good food for the most part. However, frequent business outings, takeout, alcohol, and high-calorie on-the-go snacks were creeping his calorie intake up, and he was consuming about 4,000 calories per day without even realizing it. This excess was enough to push him into positive energy balance, and he was seeing a slow increase in his weight over the past couple of years. After explaining all of the above information to him, he agreed that a slow and steady weight loss plan would be best to shift his body composition back into a more optimal range, and we would monitor both his food intake as well as his physical output and blood work. After reducing his intake by 15%, he has been able to achieve steady weight loss of between 0.5% and 1% of his body weight each week and still be able to complete his training, feel focused at work, and show up for his family. After 8 weeks, his blood work is still good and there are no symptoms of REDS. He reported feeling hungry before bed and a little lackluster towards the end of the workday, but both of these are perfectly normal signs when you're in a state of slight negative energy balance. This is a great approach that worked well for him because it was specific. But in order for you to put this to practice, you need to understand very clearly what your goal is, the time frame in which you are achieving that goal, and have a system which you are measuring the goal against both subjectively and objectively. If you can do this, then you are well and truly on your way to properly fueling your body no matter the goal. And that's a wrap for this week's episode. Let's do a quick recap. First, calories are a measure of energy, and the way we get calories are through food. More specifically, we break food down to its building blocks, and then our cells extract energy from the chemical bonds in that food. Our body then uses this energy in 4 different ways: our basal metabolic rate, digestion, NEAT, and physical activity. How much we use on each of these is specific to our lifestyle and diet, and we can make predictions on how many calories we need in a number of different ways, but the most practical is using predictive equations. I recommend the Mifflin-St. Jean or Cunningham equation, and then using activity multipliers to account for your training and lifestyle. From here, it's all about tracking and monitoring and being aware of your physical and mental health and how they are responding to your diet. Are you recovering well from your training and hitting PBs in the gym? Are you feeling motivated, or are you constantly injured and sick? All of these are clues as to whether you have got this right or not. Lastly, you need to create a system that works for you in the long run. Personally, I like to use a blended approach of tracking under the guidance of a professional while developing a monitoring system to be able to make adjustments to your intake based on your individual needs. I can't finish up the show without saying, if you are considering making changes to your diet, then please consider engaging a qualified health professional to help guide you through the process for both your physical and mental health. Now that's a wrap for this week. If you liked this episode, then we would appreciate you showing your support by leaving a 5-star review and telling a friend about it. That's all for now, and I'll see you guys next time for another episode of Performance That Matters.